Welcome into the most aggressive and the trickiest chess opening against White's Queen's pawn move. I'm Grandmaster Igor Smirnov, let's rock and roll. You initially respond with knight c4, at this point c4, the classical move and by far the most popular, and now you surprise your opponent by going pawn e5, giving up a pawn for seemingly no reason. This is known as Budapest Gambit, and after pawn takes e5, by far the vast majority of players go with their knight to g4 trying to get this pawn back. However, we haven't played a gambit just to get the pawn back. We want to be more aggressive, and we're playing a much trickier and a more provocative move, knight e4. And at first it feels like just some bad mistake. You gave up a pawn, it's still unclear why, and now you put your knight to this shaky position into opponent's territory, and plus this pawn takes away these squares where the knight could possibly retreat to, and it feels like there are plenty of ways for white to now attack your knight. However, it is much trickier than that. For example, the most natural attempt to hit this knight straight away, pawn f3, is actually already a blunder. They expected your knight to move, however they overlooked a strong counter queen h4 check. It is even stronger to initially include that in-between check from the other side, bishop b4, and we'll see why in a second. After they cover, notice that your knight also controls these two squares, making it harder for white to cover by playing knight c3, for instance. But if they gather with something like bishop to d2, then you play queen h4 at this point, checking their king. There's the only move to block that, g3, and now you sack the knight, clearing the diagonal for your queen. And at this point, we'll see why it was important to include this check, because after this trade, that is literally a checkmate. And notice that their own bishop from d2 blocks the potential escape square, and that is why it was so good for us to include that bishop b4 check, which forced them to cover this square. If we take it one step back, there was no defense for white here. From here, the knight also hits the rook, and if they, instead of capturing knight, capture this bishop right here on b4, you still can make use of this discovered check. You just gotta be careful, because you want to shut down this escape square, and you can do that by going knight e4, and that is a checkmate in one move, and you took away this square. There's also another variation that I love a lot. Another attempt for white to attack this knight would be queen to d4. Looks like white solidifies their position, hits your knight, and black's in trouble. However, you respond with the same counter-strike bishop b4. It's actually a very common theme in the Budapest Gambit. Whenever they attack your knight, you can surprise them by this counter. And here's the trick. While your knight is still there, it is harder for them to cover because your knight, once again, controls these two squares, making it harder for them to just block the check. Nevertheless, they need to do that. Let's say they go knight c3, and then you trade here, their pawn takes, they're still feeling optimistic, they're still a pawn up, they're attacking your bishop, but you once again counter blow, this time with knight c6 hitting their queen. Now they feel already some discomfort. You attack their queen, plus this pawn is somewhat under the attack as well as this one. So they play queen e3, and now you need to indeed drop your bishop back, you do that. At this point, they realize that you're about to castle, put your rook to the e-file, and start attacking them. That doesn't feel good. Therefore, they play bishop a3, which develops their bishop and controls this diagonal, therefore you can't castle anymore. But you have a really spectacular maneuver here that wins the game, and it's highly unusual. You play queen h4, hitting this pawn on c4. And it's not just a pawn, as after you grab this pawn, your queen will be right there on c4, and therefore you'll be threatening bishop takes c3 with a double attack to their king and rook. So it's a pretty strong threat. But if they go pawn to c5, like first of all, you successfully push them into checkers, and secondly, you've got queen a4, another highly unusual follow-up. Like this whole maneuver is something you've probably never seen before. That hits the bishop. It needs to go. And after the bishop goes, you continue with one more brilliant move, knight to d4. Like totally humiliating your opponent. That threatens fork, and it is actually the strongest move you could ever play. It attacks all of their most valuable pieces, and they can't move them away in one move, therefore you will win something for sure. And they can't take the knight. They can't take it by the pawn because it's pinned, and they can't take it by the queen because in this case you just recapture, and the pawn is still pinned. They can't take it again. If you're encountering a more experienced opponent and he is familiar with this threat of bishop to b4 check, he may wish to stop it by going pawn to a3. Also, I think is the first line of Stockfish. To this you can respond with another interesting idea. You can play pawn b6, which looks like just a developing move. You wish to play your bishop to b7 and to put your bishop to this long diagonal, and it's a nice thing to do indeed. However, you also set up a clever trap along the way. It feels like not only your knight is shaky now, but also this diagonal, and he may play queen d5 this time with this double attack, and it feels like your last move was just a blunder. However, you respond with knight to c5, retreating the knight. This time you're ready to play bishop b7, your knight supports that, which will hit the queen and force it back. From here, the knight is also ready to jump to b3 in some variations. However, of course, the main question is, what if he just grabs your rook? Well, there's an interesting counter-strike. You've got bishop b7, attacking the queen. The only move to go to is queen takes a7, but now after knight to c6, there is nowhere to run away. The queen is attacked, and it has nowhere to go. Of course, after queen takes b7, white still has some material compensation for the queen. But besides that, the issue is they're completely undeveloped. While you are already attacking them, you already threatened this pawn on e5, your other knight is ready to jump back there to b3 potentially, attacking there. So your development advantage adds up, and you just have this quick attack, which makes your position quite promising. One more try for your opponents to attack this exposed knight would be playing queen c2, which also seemed to make a lot of sense. Generally speaking, a very standard move for all Queen's Gambit variations, and it hits the knight from this side. Now, as you may have guessed, we're not going to retreat that easily. In most cases, we're playing a gambit we wish to attack or counterattack. And here we play a nice move, pawn d5, which also leads to a very interesting variation. Now, what do we do here? We, of course, support the knight. Capturing here on d5 is not dangerous because we've got our queen there. We would just recapture with a good position and we bring our queen to a more active square. What if they capture en passant? In this case, they renew the threat to our knight, but you counter that by going bishop f5. And again, you just prioritize quick development and attack. We're willing to give up a few pawns. In most cases, your pawns are going to capture here on c7. Of course, theoretically, there are plenty of other moves that your opponent could choose to play. We can't analyze them all. Like in general, you know the main plan, and after this, you just need to know how to find proper attacking moves and calculate them. If you wish to improve in that component, I've got a dedicated free masterclass that you can check out by clicking the link down below in the description. You can do it later. For now, let's stick to the main line. Pawn takes c7, queen takes. At this point, they feel unpleasant because of the opposition of your bishop and queen. It feels like there are some sort of discovered attacks that are coming, and they wish to move the queen out of danger. So they go queen a4 with this check. But it's okay, because you are going to develop the knight anyways. And now after they play knight f3, you can actually castle queenside, which removes your king out of this pin and also puts your rook to the open file. And now your development advantage becomes really huge, and it's really hard for white to cope with it. In fact, they're already lost. So if they play e3, for example, just trying to develop, you then go knight c5, hitting the queen, and all of a sudden, it actually runs out of squares, because your pieces control pretty much everything where the queen could possibly go to. So if the queen goes here, a6 just traps it straight away, you win the game. If instead the queen goes to a3, that's a little trickier. You have another strong follow-up, knight to b4, which looks like a blunder because they could capture it, and they have to, because if not, you play knight c2, forking pretty much everything that they have. But if they capture it, now after knight d3 check, you set it up for one more discovered check, bishop takes b4, and on the next move you grab the bishop as well, and you win the game. One of the safest and best ways for your opponent to react is just to play a calm move knight to f3, without trying to make use of this exposed knight. Also, they can't really play knight c3, or rather they don't want to, because in this case you take and you completely mess up their pawn structure. Therefore, knight f3 is probably the most solid option. In this case, I recommend that you just play d6, offering them to trade, which in most cases they will. And again, Stockfish of course tells you that white can play something else, but your opponents are not Stockfish, they'll play more obvious moves. After this trade, you're having this long-term lasting initiative thanks to your lead in development. And that extra pawn is only going to matter if your opponent is capable to survive the attack that you're going to have along the next 10-15 moves, but in most cases, you know, it's very hard to defend like that. Now, they're going to play e3, you develop, and you aim, generally speaking, to play bishop f5, queen f6, and castle queenside, which gives you a super aggressive position. A cherry on the cake is that the most played move in this position by white is bishop d3. They're trying to develop a bishop and hit your knight. Seems like there's nothing wrong with that move, but it's a blunder. Because, as we did in previous variations, whenever they attack your knight, you first look for counter-attacking options. And you've got one here, bishop b4, just as we've seen in other variations. The problem for white here is that either they have to move the king, which will leave it exposed and vulnerable to your future attacks, but if they try to cover, what can they do? They can't cover with a knight. In this case, you can take, And after that, that's a double attack. They lose some material right here. And if instead they try to cover on d2 somehow, then it blocks the connection between the queen and bishop, and you can just go ahead and grab it. After this, you're up a piece, and you keep attacking. Alright, so bishop d3 was a blunder, and if they play a more careful move, bishop e2, then you just develop, and after they castle, you could have castled, that's okay, but it's even stronger to castle queenside. You play queen f6, which puts the pressure down here, making it harder for them to develop their queenside, and if they do, whatever, doesn't really matter, say knight d2, you castle queenside. Because in this case, not only you castle, but you also put your rook to this open file. And let's say after the trade, it's very hard for white to defend this position. First of all, they can easily blunder this discovered attack after bishop takes h2 check. Some of them will blunder that. But even if they find a way to somehow cover their queen, it's again not easy. They can't easily develop this bishop because that would drop this pawn on b2. And generally speaking, you are ready to attack on the king side. You've got two bishops looking there. You are ready to play g5, g4, kick this knight away, and develop quite a massive attack. So again, really hard for white to find proper defense here. There's one very interesting game in the Budapest Gambit that attracted my attention because it was played in an all-the-ball tournament. It was not a blitz game, and the white player, Fajarowicz, is a very strong grandmaster. He was the European champion. He played pawn e3. Black responded with knight c6, hitting the pawn. So far, so good. And at this point, the proper move for white would be knight to f3, probably, guarding the pawn. And after this, you can transpose into the line that we talked about before, after d6, right, where you have some lasting compensation for the pawn. However, Fajarowicz played bishop d3, an tempting move and a common mistake. We know that trying to attack this knight very often backfires, because instead of moving the knight back, you counter-strike, and very often you do that by going bishop b4 check, which puts white into this dilemma of what to do. Like, they either have to move the king, centralize it and make it vulnerable long-term, or they have to cover somehow, and they can't cover by the knight because you have two pieces attacking this square. And if they cover with bishop to d2, then now your knight does not have to go back. It can instead be traded off, and now you also don't lose time, you actually keep attacking. You can now take on e5 and hit this bishop, and after the bishop goes, you could have developed, but it's even stronger to keep attacking by going queen g5. And it's also uncomfortable for white to guard this pawn as well as the rook. For example, if they play g3, now their whole position becomes really weakened, and you just need to be careful not to blunder f4, this double attack, but you can drop the queen back, and you have this severe pressure across all these diagonals. It's actually quite hard for white to even complete their development. In one game they played f4, trying to, kick black's pieces back, but this time the other knight did the same trick. Instead of retreating, black countered with an unusual move, queen c6, countering the rook. And there is no normal way for white to guard it. He tried e4, but it actually overlooked that black could still take queen takes c4, making use of the pin, therefore the knight can't take it. And what do you do now about this rook? The move knight to f3 would fail quite spectacularly to the double pin, which is a very rare thing in chess. Knight takes f3, and now not the bishop, not the knight can capture it because they both are pinned. Like, that's crazy, and black obviously wins. Alright, if you wish to improve your chess level overall, feel free to check out my free masterclass by clicking the link up there. And today we talked about countering the queen's pawn move, pawn d4. If you wish to know the trappiest opening against the most popular king's pawn move, pawn e4, check out the video right there.